By way of introduction, those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Del Rio. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I'm a PK, but an unconventional PK because my pastor parents, I'm not going to be too overgeneralizing here, but they modeled for my brothers and I what they preached from the pulpit. When I was 8 years old, they were inspired by Romans 5:20, which says, where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. As they began their ministry, Abounding Grace, their theory of how to launch was to ask the NYPD where the worst drug spots were in New York, figuring if they found a lot of drugs, they'd find a lot of sin, and if you believe Scripture, experience God's abounding grace. And so as an 8-year-old boy, I accompanied them to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and that was my baptism into ministry. And it's the same philosophy that they instilled in me that I'm here echoing 34 years later for all of you. So there is great sin, there's great need, but where the need is greatest, God's grace is strongest, His light shines brightest, and that's why all of you do what you do. So let's jump right in. We're going to begin with this fundamental promise. Maybe you've perpetuated it in your own context, but how many of you have either heard or perhaps even said, if you stay in school, you'll be all right? Right? Just stay in school, graduate, and you'll be all right. When you come out the other end, you'll have the skills you need to achieve in life. But the reality is that in most American cities, this is an empty promise. In New York City last year, we received the prize for education reform nationally. We were recognized as the premier urban school district. In the fall, in September of 2007, you know what our graduation rate was in June of 2008? 44%. And the majority of those kids graduated with less than Regent diplomas, right? Very few actually graduated with a Regent diploma. And so we've got an issue because for decades we have made this promise. I remember as a kid watching NBA's All-Star Weekend Jam. You remember that? They don't do it anymore, or at least not the way they did it back then. But on Saturday mornings on Channel 4, right, Ahmad Rashad would be the host, remember? And they'd have these big concerts, and it was all about read to achieve, right? And I remember watching that because I was just getting my feet wet in youth ministry. Well, I was a youth in youth ministry. But I remember thinking, but if I go home on a Sunday or a Monday after school and mom's smoking crack and my brother is selling the dope that mom's smoking and my sister is pregnant and she's 14 and we share a bedroom and I was a witness to the act that impregnated her, 2 + 2 don't even equal 4 for me, right? And who cares who George Washington was? So I remember back then that feeling like a very empty promise, but the new numbers tell us how empty it really is. In fact, it's such a disconnect between the rhetoric that we preach that it's been called the greatest injustice of our day. Wendy Kopp, who's the president of Teach for America, who's been recognized by every media outlet, entity that does these kind of recognitions as one of America's premier leaders, has called educational inequity our nation's greatest injustice. The average high school graduate from an urban school district, again, these are the kids who graduate, is an 8th grade reading level. That means that the graduates cannot compete in college. They can't complete a college application. They can't complete a job application. They can't conduct the Bible study that we urge them to conduct from Sunday through the following week. They can't calculate tithes, right? We're in the midst. The media tells us, the politicians tell us The economists tell us we're in the midst of the greatest economic collapse since the Great Depression. And it was caused by the collapse of the financial markets, triggered by people who were getting too much credit, right? More credit than they could afford to repay. But what baffles me is nobody's made the connection between credit I can't afford and the inability to do math at grade level, right? If I can't do math at grade level, that means I can't manage a household budget. It means I can't coordinate my finances. It means I don't have the skills to receive the letter telling me I'm pre-qualified for a loan. I don't have the skills to understand that even though I might be pre-qualified, in their math universe, in my math universe, I know I can't afford that loan, right? And so if we don't have those skills, we can't do the basics. And if you're a ministry, it means every time you ask somebody to make a pledge, right? Anytime you ask them even to calculate tithes, that becomes a crisis. I'll write $100 on the pledge card, but I've been in the red for the last 18 months. I'm not coming out of the red this month. That means you're not getting your $100. So we need to care about education. That is, if they graduate, they have the 8th grade skill set. But the likelihood that a 9th grader will graduate on time in our cities amounts to a coin toss. It's a 50-50 coin toss if a 9th grader will graduate on time in our cities. And forget the on time. 52% of African American high school students will never graduate on time or after time. They won't get a GED. They won't complete the basics. More than that, 57% of our Hispanic students in high school will not graduate. In the suburbs, the numbers improve dramatically. And that is that gap, that injustice, right? Because in the suburbs, sometimes that gap is in excess of 25%. You know, I've been talking about New York. We've got 44%. By contrast, Pastor Harvey Carey, who we heard this morning, he's from Detroit. Their graduation rate is about 28%. 28%. And it's like that for cities all over our country. Even rivals agree. During our last election, it was great to hear President-elect Obama say things like, I don't want to send another generation of American children to failing schools. I don't want that future for my daughters, and I don't want that future for your sons and your daughters, right? He acknowledges access to failing schools is not an access to an education, right? Even John McCain, he went further. He called educational injustice the civil rights issue of our day. Guys, as evangelicals, and I know most of us would count ourselves in that camp, right? Evangelicals missed the first civil rights movement in droves. Not all, but many. We were absent. We can't be absent from this civil rights agenda. Equal access to public education is not access to education. And that's the reality for many of our students. In my own life, I mentioned my parents. They brought us to the hood. That was my baptism into ministry. But I was always in private school. And so no matter how much I preached on a Friday night or a Thursday night or in a small group, you can do it. Go to school. The reality was, for a lot of them, my education was very different than the education that they were receiving. So what is 2020 Vision for Schools? The first graders who began school this fall are the high school graduating class of the year 2020. Is it possible that as the youth pastors in New York City, we could say enough is enough? This is the generation for whom our promises actually make a difference. The words we preach will be matched by the lives we live. We tell them stay in school and you'll be all right. Well, we're going to commit, number one, to helping them stay in school, and number two, to filling the gaps that exist in the system. Can this be that generation for whom that promise becomes real? If it will be, it requires a paradigm shift. Right? For so long, we have reduced the debate in our churches about public schools to things like school prayer. And we actually misunderstand that debate. We say the Supreme Court outlawed school prayer. You know what a principal told me? The principal said as long as there are tests in public schools, there will be prayer in public schools. Right? All that the Supreme Court outlawed in the 60s was a 30-second non-denominational prayer that probably didn't mean a whole lot anyway. Right? Because it was being recited out of rote by kids who didn't know what it was talking about because it was so vaguely, poorly written, it didn't mean much. But that's all that's been outlawed. And so is it possible that we can stop making the fake arguments and instead begin to view our schools as partners that God has ordained to equip our kids to become who God has called us to be? That's the other aspect of 2020 vision. We need our vision of schools corrected, right? We need to stop demonizing the school system and begin serving and supporting and working without a political agenda to transform the public education system. And so the question becomes, what would happen if and to become answers to those prayers? So 2020 vision for schools it's a paradigm for thinking about how we can begin to engage schools as partners. And there are three elements to this matrix. There is the arrow on the matrix is the vocational calling, and we're going to talk about that in a second. The horizontal is how does our church actually develop that relationship with the school? And that's this afternoon session. We'll touch on that briefly, and then my colleague Edwin Pacheco, who's the coordinator of 2020, he's going to make it tangible and practical. And so we'll look at that. And then the third dimension is how do we begin to engage students? I love Pastor Harvey's challenge. How many of us can begin to say, if you die in the work of the ministry because you're associated with me, right? We need to view our students. We need to, view youth ministry not about ministering to our youth, but empowering our youth to minister. And that's the student engagement side of the 2020 Vision Matrix. Those are the three elements. First, for this thing called vocational calling. Where does this come from? Well, it's really the engine that is going to drive 2020 in your church. And it begins, if you're going to move the church along the paradigm, the matrix, the engagement, we have to begin with this idea of vocational calling. Where does it come from? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11 says, and he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers for the work of the ministry. Is that what it says? Does it say that the people behind the pulpit are the ones that are supposed to be doing ministry in our churches? No, we misunderstand the verse, right? It says, I've anointed the pastor and the teacher and the evangelist to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. That's the first and most fundamental element of 2020 Vision for Schools. It's an understanding that God has already dispersed his body throughout the school system to be salt and light, to redeem it, to preserve it, to transform it. If only we would change the paradigm from the youth pastor being the guy who does the work. If you saw this morning when the question was asked, how many of you are full-time in youth ministry but get paid doing something else? right? That is the overwhelming majority of youth workers in our city. In fact, 3 years ago, the impetus for the conversation that evolved into 2020 was a gathering on behalf of the Billy Graham Association. We convened 787 youth workers. Pretty impressive number, and it's the official Billy Graham head count, and they count heads really well, right? 787. One of the presenters asked the same set of questions we heard today, but the lights were on, so we had a different effect. Bottom line is a couple dozen people in the room actually got paid to do youth ministry, and everybody else was a volunteer. Well, guess what? For us, that picture is a recipe for failure. It's a visual of what God says: the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. In our city, just in the 5 boroughs, there are 2 million young people 18 and under. In the greater New York Metroplex, which includes a 20-mile radius around our city, there are 5 million kids, and we've got a couple dozen that our church structures expect to actually reach them. It can be done. We have to change the definition, and the definition becomes: if you have a relationship with a young person, God has called you to be a youth minister. Right? If you are a parent, if you are a grandparent, if you are an employer, if you're the McDonald's manager who hires kids to flip burgers, if you are the sales clerk at Foot Locker that sells the same kid another $150 pair of sneakers after they bought a pair last week, you're derelict in your duty as a youth pastor, a youth worker, to explain to them why they don't need another $150 pair of sneakers when they're failing math in schools and they can't figure it out for themselves. It is a redefinition of Luke 10. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So pray that the Lord of the harvest would send out laborers into the harvest field. Vocational calling is redefining youth minister to mean anyone who has that meaningful relationship with a young person, has been ordained by God and set apart by God to have a meaningful impact on that kid's life. And what happens? Well, I challenge you, if you get permission from your pastor on a Sunday, instead of doing a traditional altar call, at the end of the service, invite people who are students to raise their hand, and then invite the parents of the students to stand up with them, and then invite their grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins to stand beside them, and then invite all the people in your church that work for a school as a teacher, custodian, principal to stand. Invite them to stand, the support staff, and what you will observe from the pulpit is that 50 to 80% of the people in your church on Sunday are already positioned within the school system to transform it. That is the essence of vocational calling. We're already there. We're just not thinking about the giant. And as a result, we haven't activated the giant slayers to do their job. We've already been dispersed, and it's our job as youth pastors, youth workers, volunteers, paid or otherwise, to activate those 80% of the people in your pews to be about the business of slaying that giant in our city. Matthew 5, you are the salt of the earth. In the interest of time, because we got started late, we're not going to read this. You're familiar with the passage, though. But he says we're salt. Salt, first and foremost, is a preservative. Back then, it was such a vital part of that culture, because they didn't have refrigeration, that people would actually get paid in salt, right? Because salt kept their food fresh. It allowed it to last longer. You've heard the expression, you're not worth your weight in salt? Because back then, salt was currency. It was that vital to the functioning of the society. He says, you're the salt. Are you so vital to the functioning of your community that an opportunity to interact with you is viewed as a payment, a blessing? Because if you're not, we got some catching up to do, because that's the invitation and the mandate that God has given to us. The second part of the matrix is that engaging the schools matrix. And here I'm just going to highlight some things, and then Edwin is going to unpack this, because this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of developing the relationship. But it begins by redefining success. The way we've done it in our ministry models is to define success by salvations, by church attendance, by water baptisms. If you're Pentecostal, by praying in tongues, right? We define success. And guess what? A principal of a school could care less how many of her students pray in tongues. They don't care how many of them are attending your church. Our obligation is to love that school, and loving that school means saying to the school, what matters to us is irrelevant. What matters to you? How do you define success for your school? Is it graduation rates? Is it test results? Is it college entrance success? Is it not just getting into college, but getting out of college? Completing college, right? Well, just as an aside, if I read at an 8th grade level and I start college this upcoming semester, I'm not going to last. And we should not be so shocked when our kids come home after a semester or two and say, hey, I need some time off. I'm going to go back, but I need some time off. You've heard that, right? We've got to redefine success. Define it the way that they define it. What is the issue for that school? Maybe they've got an unusually high crime rate in that school. And for them, the most pressing metric is reducing crime. Well, is there a way that we can begin to care about what they care about? Beyond that, it continues with intentional prayer. We preach this God that answers prayer. Well, what would happen if your church began to pray as often as your church prays? And that's the key. I don't know your church culture. If you have a midweek prayer service, a monthly prayer vigil, a small group prayer band, whatever you do as a corporate body to pray, get the school on your prayer agenda. And don't make it abstract. Let's pray in concrete terms for PS 34. Down the block from where we meet. God, meet the people there. Help us to be an answer to those prayers. The other advantage, beyond just the correlation between prayer and a God who answers, is as we begin to pray, God turns our heart. So if we got a church full of people that don't get it yet, they don't understand why youth should matter to them, get them praying in tangible ways for that school. And as an aside, I'm just going to throw an idea out here. I hope it sticks someday. But the idea is, what would happen if you invited the principal of PS 34 to your pulpit on a Sunday and for 5 minutes asked him or her to share the vision for that school? And then as a congregation, prayed for that principal and embraced their vision as our vision. Basically said, what you've outlined in that presentation is our prayer agenda and our service agenda. If that school is within walking distance, it will be inescapable. That service will take on meaning. When they circle the church to look for parking, they're going to be prayer walking that school, right? They're going to be walking past it on the way to your building. And it becomes tangible. It's not just something theoretical. And there are a lot of ideas. And again, we'll get into some more of those later. But corporate prayer, small groups, prayer walks, prayer guides, individual, personal, corporate prayer, however you guys do it. Devotions. The second thing, now we've been praying. Well, I'm tired of Christians who pray, God, send somebody to so-and-so to bless them. Right? We already have enough of a relationship with so-and-so to know they need to be blessed. We shouldn't be praying that God sends somebody else. He's already put you in so-and-so's life. You bless them, right? That's what it means to build a resume of trust. We become answers to those prayers. We go and we begin to overcome mistrust. A friend of mine is a 25-year veteran of the New York Public Schools. Currently, he works as the superintendent of a school district in Massachusetts. He said to me when I asked him about this idea, he said, Jeremy, oh, by the way, he's also an ordained minister, so he functions in both worlds. He said, in 25 years that I was an educator in New York, we had every statistical problem with our schools: high crime, corruption, underperformance, failing test grades, the whole nine. And in 25 years, the only time the Christian community organized around an educational issue was to protest the rainbow curriculum. If you're from New York, you know what that was. It was a sex ed curriculum in the early 90s. The only time in 25 years. As a result, educators, he said, have no reason to trust the church. It's almost an oxymoron because so many church folks are in the school, which tells me they will trust Christians when Christians embrace their terms, their language. We've got to develop that trust. We do it by developing relationship. How do you develop any relationship? You spend time. You treat the principal to lunch. You don't make her pay the bill, right? You honor the teachers. Simple idea. Why can't we go to the school at 7 o'clock in the morning, bring breakfast to the teacher's lounge, and serve it without condition? That includes, they don't have to pray. If they come and they eat your bagel and coffee and don't say grace, we don't persecute, because we're there to bless and to develop the relate. There's so many ideas, and again, we're going to talk more about that later. But then as we cultivate that relationship, things are going to surface. Real felt needs. We live in a world of education defunding, right? Arts programs. How many of our schools have thriving art programs? And how many of our churches have music pastors? Why can't our music pastor do an 8-week music class at the school, after school, and culminate it in a concert that showcases the kids? Right? Why can't we as a church adopt their holiday event, whatever that event is? They wouldn't otherwise have the event because they don't have the funding, so we'll pay for it to bless the kids. There are so many discrete projects, but they add real value. Other things, beautification efforts, painting. If the school is in disrepair, sending an army of volunteers in. By the way, I see a lot of folks scrambling to take notes and keep up. In the interest of time, I'm kind of racing through this, so I'm going to let you in on a secret. You can download this entire PowerPoint and the lecture notes and the audio and video, all right? You can download it. So keep on writing so that the people who sent you think that you were paying attention. But if you skip a line, don't stress it. You can get it at 2020schools.net. But anyway, we'll come back to that at the end. I see people like frantically trying to keep up. And I should have let you in on the secret. No, I probably shouldn't have, because now at least I know you paid attention to half the message. You can check out now if you want. But what happens as we're responding to those felt needs and they're starting to trust us more, and as our churches are growing and our capacity is developing, can we become an ongoing presence at the campus? Chances are you already are a presence, because if you're a community church, your kids are already students there. Your parents may not actually be attending the parent-teacher conferences, but you could start to tell them they need to be there, right? Engaging on that. Oh, as an aside, let me just say something about this. Every school in New York City at the local grassroots school level is governed by a committee of people that includes the principal, a couple of teachers, and parents. And if it's a high school, it also includes students. Well, every one of our youth groups should have a student on every single parent committee that our schools represent. I mean, every one of those committees. And we need to be equipping our parents to get appointed to those committees. But that's I'm sorry, Edwin. I'm stealing Ed's thunder, but he's going to blow it up afterwards. He's going to enter the matrix with you all later. But as we do that, we develop a presence, right? An example of this, we live in a fatherless age. I don't have to preach that message to you. But how many of our kids have no relationship with a dad? Or even many of them with a mother or a father in some cases. Well, statistics say those kids are on the fast track to prison, unemployment, pregnancy. But statistics also say that a relationship with an adult could take them off the fast track in a heartbeat. Can we start finding some mentors in our churches that would adopt a kid? Forget the school, just adopt one kid, right? Can we start doing some after-school programs, some creative art programs like the music minister that does the music class, or the youth pastor that volunteers to coach the basketball team, right? There are a lot of ways to become a presence, and I'm going to flip the slide so I don't continue to. Look, all of this stuff is in the website, and Edwin's going to do a better job than me presenting it anyway. Next, on that matrix, this is that horizontal on the box, right? Where we're engaging the school. As we have developed some trust, we have some relationships, as we have begun to meet felt needs through acts of service, as we've developed an ongoing presence, now all of a sudden we have credibility to affect policy. Too many of our pastors think they have the right to criticize public education when they have never been in relationship with a public educator or a school, right? Well, let's develop that relationship. As we've earned the right to be heard, then we can begin to affect just policies within our schools. Then we can begin to leverage our credibility, not only at the school level, but the more of us coordinate through efforts like 2020, we can scale up and leverage that credibility on a system-wide level. The ABCs of educational policy, real basic. What are they? Appointments, right? Appointments at the most senior level of our school system are all political decisions. We need to make sure that men and women of character have been appointed. And it's similarly at the school level, right? You as a parent need to be selected by the principal and the team to join the club. Well, that's a political policy decision. We need to have the relationship that suggests our recommendations will actually mean something, carry some weight. It's about budgets, allocation of resources, right? In a world of limited resources, political policy decisions are made every day about what to fund and what not to fund. And then lastly, it's curriculum, right? It's all about testing right now. If there's well, we don't have time to get into all the details, but curriculum things, and I would suggest you track with us at 2020schools.net, because as often as possible, we're posting issues related to this so we can start to educate ourselves. An individual church acting by itself has no credibility at the policy level, but collectively, we can impact our city system. I've been kind of hinting at this for a while. When I say what would happen if a church adopts a school and prays, check this out. In New York City, we have actually a little more now, 1,400 public schools. Sounds like a lot, right? 1,400. We have in the same city 7,100 evangelical, Pentecostal, and charismatic churches. I wish I had the number that included the Catholic churches and the mainline denominational churches. I don't have a reliable number for that. But for our purposes today, let's go with 7,100. That's more than 5 churches that preach a God who impacts society for every one school. As we coordinate collectively and we begin to do this with regular interaction and communication, we can affect systemic changes. The last prong of the matrix is engaging the students. What does that mean? Fortune magazine last year, one of the financial executives now in disgrace, Stanley O'Neill from American Express, right? Well, in 2007, he was still one of the non-disgraced executives. So he was on the cover of Fortune magazine in a leadership issue. And it said the world's best businesses are realizing that no matter what business they're in, their real business is raising up leaders. It's developing leaders. This, at its core, is a philosophy that Jesus preached, right? Jesus, at the end of his life, stood before his disciples and he said, go and make converts. Go and make people that attend your church functions regularly. Go and make tithers. Is that what he said? No, he said, go and make disciples of nations, not just individuals. The disciple shouldn't be the exception to the rule. He said, make disciples of entire communities, entire states, cities, nations. He said, and by the way, when Jesus said, go and make a disciple, that word carried a very particular implication. And what was it? Every disciple Jesus made was a leader, right? For good or bad. Not every one of his leaders turned out above reproach. In fact, you all think I'm going to mention Judas, right? Peter. At the end of a 3-year intensive leadership development program, Peter pulled out his piece and attempted to assassinate somebody. He still had anger management issues, right? But that did not disqualify him from leadership. He was called a disciple before he overcame his anger management issues, right? He was drafted into Jesus' leadership development program before he was qualified. He did not measure by evidence. He was not living up to the standards outlined in Timothy and Titus for church leadership. And yet Jesus called him a disciple. Guys, that means that gives me permission to go into a school and develop a discipleship program. But wisdom says don't call it discipleship. You ain't getting through the door if you call it discipleship. Call it leadership. And respect the boundaries. Respect, right? Be a person of integrity. Respect. Don't go in there to do leadership and then start sneaking in altar calls on the side. Because then you get the rest of us in trouble. But what school doesn't want leaders to be developed among its student body? That says what I just said. But that's written the way it's written in your book, so I'll let you look at it for 30 seconds. Nah, 3. Let's go. So what happens? You get it on the website. It's all right. You're not going to be penalized if it's an open book test and you've got the book. Students are called to lead. Why do I say that? 1 Timothy 4. Don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but be an example, be a leader to the rest of your congregation, to your community, to your school, in life, in word, in faith, in conduct, and in purity. That was the mandate. And guess what? We heard this morning that a little shepherd boy, unqualified, the least qualified person in Israel to confront the giant, was the only one brave enough to do that very task, right? Esther, completely unqualified to be a dignitary, a statesperson who rescued a nation from genocide. All she had done is win a beauty contest. And if you interpret her story in one form of interpretation, she slept with the judges of the beauty contest. Not exactly the best resume for a political dignitary. Well, maybe, but I'll leave that alone. Right? And she delivered a people from genocide. And what about Josiah, that 8-year-old king, who even though he became king at 8, ushered in an era of revival among a nation that had consistently defied and rebelled against God. And that woman, we call her Mary. Talk about being unqualified for a task, right? She lacked the fundamental prerequisite of conception. She hadn't even engaged the act. Never mind be qualified to raise the kid. And yet God called her even though she was unqualified. Why can't we approach our schools in the same way? Let's take those underperforming kids. Let's take those troublemakers. Let's take those kids who have anger management issues. Let's take those giants in our schools like Harvey talked to us this morning. And let's begin to move them from troubled beyond passing. I hate when people aspire to a 65. I don't want my heart surgeon to have scored a 65 on the practicum, right? Why do we accept 60s and 65s as if that's enough? Now, I'm not saying we poo-poo it. If the guy was pulling a 30 and now he's got a 60, you need to celebrate. But if you know that young person is capable of an 85 or a 95, do not settle for the 65 because you're doing them an injustice. You're telling them your discipleship matters less than mine, right? Your calling matters less than mine. But, by the way, and this is an aside and I got to get off this soapbox, if you are not a student, you have no business teaching students. We have to model ongoing commitment to learning and leadership development. This is a different sermon. I apologize for integrating it into this one. But if you are not modeling for our students what it means to be an effective learner, you've got no business teaching them. And so I would question, and I would invite you to question, whether you've got the right job or if you got something you need to repent. The beautiful thing is we serve a God of abounding grace, and so even that sin is forgivable. But we need to get serious about repenting. Call it what it is. If you're a lazy student, call it what it is, right? If you're not committed, call it what it is. Ask God to forgive you. Become accountable to that struggle with somebody that can hold you accountable, and let's overcome it so that we can preach with integrity to our kids about why they need to become good students. So the challenge of 10%, what's the goal, right? As we're developing these leaders, as we're engaging the student side of this matrix, sociologists and the people that study this kind of stuff say that if you can get 10% of a community to buy into something, the community's going to change, right? If you can get 10%, for example, Jeffrey Canada, who's the president of Harlem Children's Zone, they have an adopt-a-block approach to neighborhood and community development. He says that in their experience, and he's regarded as one of the best, that all they need to get on that block to see it changed is 10 to 20% of the people to buy in. To buy into what? To buy into a value system that values success, that values calling, that values discipline, that values leadership, that values all the things that we preach on Sunday, that we ask our kids to live Monday through Saturday, right? We get 10% of our kids in a leadership development track. I don't know a single principal that's not going to be excited. They're tired of the biggest impediment to a student learning is other students. They're tired of that. They'd like to see 10% of their kids that are motivating the rest to do something special. An example of what this looks like. If the local school in your neighborhood has 1,000 students, just to keep the numbers easy, right? What's 10% of 1,000? 100. If I'm starting a leadership class in my school tomorrow, a principal would be a fool to give me 100 students, right? Because I haven't proven myself. We need to be accountable for our results, not just our rhetoric. So I say, give me 12 in the first year. 12 is kind of an arbitrary number, but not really, because Jesus had how many disciples, right? And he had an attrition rate. So we can't be too discouraged if not all of them. Well, anyway, we got 12. Start with freshmen because we're creating a pipeline. Year 2, we keep the freshmen who are now sophomores and we get 12 more freshmen. Now we got 24. In year 3, we keep those and we get 48 freshmen. And they're being mentored by the people who've already come through the program. And then by year 4, we keep those 48, we get 48 more, we've got 96. We're right on the cusp of 10%. You keep doing these numbers, and within a very short period of time, every single student in that school will be on some level on the stage of becoming a leader in that school and in that community. That's the challenge for us. We can start this in our youth ministries. I'm taking a little more liberty on this because this ain't part of Edwin's workshop. So I got some grace, right? But we begin to do this in our churches, right? Because where we already have access, we already have an open door to the kids that are in our youth groups right now. We want to reach more, but we've got start where you are planted with the people you already have. And let's commit to a intentional leadership development process with our kids. So what happens? This is not exclusive Christian club stuff, right? We're not just saying all the youth groups, send me your kids in the school. No, we're looking for any kid that are doing things in other areas. And what happens if we're raising them up to be leaders, now they're also influencing the basketball team. They're influencing the dance club. They're influencing the science fiction folks. They're on the student council. They're exercising leadership. And most importantly, they're leaders in their classrooms. They're setting a different set of expectations within the classrooms. That's the overview, the vision for 2020. That's the paradigm, the way of thinking about the engagement. I know there's a lot to that. And so I'm going to close with an invitation. In fact, it's more of an appeal. This is a crisis. It's been a crisis for a long time. You've heard the numbers. 1.2 million public school students, right? We already know too few of them graduate. Well, 40% of them do math at grade level, actually read at grade level. 30% do math at grade level. The numbers are staggering. If you play with the percent, if you not play with, but just do the math, you find that populations larger than Boston and Washington, D.C. and Seattle every single day in our schools can't read or do math at grade level. That's overwhelming. The population of our public schools by themselves is the 10th largest city in America. The 1.2 million public school students is the 10th largest city in America. God has called us to be fishers of men, right? It's one of many metaphors that Jesus used for the leaders that he invited, the disciples. He said, come be fishers of men. Well, if we're in youth ministry, our fish are congregating every day in schools. It's not just a metaphor. It's very literal. And if they're literally in schools, and we're supposed to be fishing for them, we've got to get into the schools. I'm going to suggest something. One of the biggest factors in my paradigm of youth ministry changing was my brother Jonathan, who said some other workshop. He don't need to hear me give another workshop, right? He was a full-time youth pastor at the church my parents pastor, but like a lot of urban ministries, was basically living below the poverty line, right? Didn't make a livable wage and wanted to get married and understood if he's going to get married, his first ministry is at home. He's got to be able to support the family, but he still felt called to youth ministry. So you know what he did? He told me one day after he got the ball rolling, he said, Jeremy, I'm applying for the Teachers Fellows program, right? He said, and check this out. He said, not only am I applying for the Teachers Fellow program, but my goal is to get accepted to the program and to get placed in Middle School 34, which is the one that funnels most of the kids in my youth group. And he said, that will be the best extension of my youth ministry. And check it out, I'll actually be able to provide for my family. And I'll have an access to the families of the kids. Long story short, he applied, he got accepted to the fellows program. He then had to apply to the school and he got a job opening to teach, of all subjects, math to 7th graders. He's teaching them how to tithe, but he don't call it that, right? But before he ever taught a day of his life in the classroom, the principal called him that summer and said, the Department of Education is restructuring. And now for the first time, we need a dean for our middle school. And we think you'd be perfect because you already know so many of the kids, right? Your work you do with the youth center and the church, you're interested. And before he ever taught a day in his life, he became the dean of the middle school. And he still teaches in the classroom. This was this is his 3rd year teaching, so 3 summers ago. But what that taught me was, number one, we just have to be there. He didn't even prove himself in the classroom. He just got in the school to teach. Why? Because he shifted his definition of success for that relationship. For that relationship, the definition was, I'm going to teach kids how to do math. And I'm teaching kids that I already know and I already love because it's a community I believe in. And it opened the door for him now to have influence on a far greater level at that school. Why am I saying that? People, we've got to get creative. We need to start thinking beyond the box. We have boxed in youth ministry to our buildings, our schedules, the constraints of our paying jobs, the realities that most of you who are still young, I mean, I lived this, so I feel it really deeply, right? I remember what it was like to be a 22-year-old youth pastor, graduate student, and new husband. And I had a job. And the struggle that represented to manage my time and to really do impacting youth ministry is overwhelming. How do you be a new husband, or maybe you're not married yet, but you want to get married? Maybe you're actually courting somebody with the hope of being married one day, right? So there's all these things competing for our time. We got to get outside of the box of all those constraints. Let's start activating the people. Let's stay committed to this. And so the last appeal to you is, if this resonates with you, if this is a giant that you're committed to slaying, to become part of 2020 Vision for Schools, go to the website, 2020schools.net. First thing to do is register. There's a little button on the side, actually a link on the side. Click the link, fill out the form. It's easy as that, right? Register so we know you exist, and we know where you're from, and we know what school you care about, right? And that way we can begin these kinds of dialogues. We understand that because this is a new paradigm, a lot of things about how we do stuff have to shift, and we're going to open this up to questions, but we're committed as much as possible to giving away the idea, giving away our best practices, giving away your best practices. So please, don't tell us something because you want to make $1 off of it, right? If you figured out the golden key to get into the school, don't charge the rest of us for the golden key. Share it so we can all learn from it together. But that's the commitment of 2020 Vision for Schools. And I want to acknowledge not only Edwin Pacheco, who will do the afternoon workshop, raise your hand, but also Walter Sotelo. Edwin and Walter are the co-chairs of the Coalition of Urban Youth Workers, which is a local network. If you don't belong to it, get connected. Talk to Walter or Edwin afterwards, because the coalition has been the conduit for everything that has become 2020 Vision for Schools, and you need to be part of that relational network so we can grow together, learn together, cry together, pray together, be inspired together, strategize together, slay some giants together, right? Let's do it.